Today we're going to start talking about different techniques that we can use to create geometry. In this case, a mesh that we can use to create a character if we wanted to, or anything that we would want to rig and animate. There are two different types of meshes that are typically created called watertight and non-watertight. What they mean by watertight is if I were to create this mesh and I poured water into the model, there's no gaping holes or no unwelded vertices. So none of the water would get out. None of the water would leak out. So it's called a watertight model. And the reason why we have watertight models is because back in earlier production of video games and some rendering engines, if you had these models that had holes in them or two vertices were real close and supposed to be welded vertices, but they weren't and they're not welded, it would have errors. And sometimes it wouldn't even compile. So you had to go back and fix those. So we came up with a technique called watertight. And within watertight, we have two different types there. We have watertight that's comprised of different shapes and geometry. And then we have a watertight model that is all one piece of geometry. What we're going to look at today is creating a watertight model that's comprised of different geometry or different shapes that are put together. We didn't talk about the non-watertight, which most video game engines and movie renderers today, they can be non-watertight or whatever. And we will have a video that goes over that specifically, but I don't want to take up a lot of the video talking about that when the purpose of this specific video is to talk about how to create a watertight mesh that's comprised of different geometry or different shapes. So I have an idea of what I want to do, so I'm just going to go ahead and get started. And first, I'm going to come into my standard primitives and I'm going to start with a box. Okay. Now from here, I know some of the things that I'm going to be doing. So I can change my geometry. I do know that I want maybe 2 here. So I have 3 in total and 2 here. Okay. So I've got kind of like a 3x3 basically. I'm going to right click and convert this to an editable poly. Right now, as this is a watertight model. I don't have any holes. I don't have any missing geometry. All of my vertices are welded. And what I mean by gaping holes, if I selected this polygon and deleted it, and now I can kind of see inside my mesh, this is no longer watertight because I have this gaping hole here. And what I mean by vertices, like right now, this is one vertex. But if I were to break this vertex, and let me do this real quick, break it, then I can grab, and when I grab one, this has been broken into all segmented vertex. So I have 1, 2, 3. I should have quite a few here. Okay, so I have 3 vertices. So if I move this down here, move this up here, then my vertex, even when they were all together after I broke them, this is technically 3 vertices. If I come in and weld it, I can see how before I had 34 vertices and now I have 32. So now this is again watertight. Okay, so what I'm going to do is start shaping this. So I'm going to select vertices. I'm going to scale how I want it to be. Like I said, I kind of have an idea of what I want to create. It's very simple. But since we're just learning how to manipulate this geometry, simple is just fine. There's nothing wrong with simple. So I'm kind of making kind of a chest plate. Okay. Out a little bit. Out a little bit. Maybe I want this to be out a little more for the purposes of what I'm going to do. maybe even have this back a little bit. In an earlier video, we talked about Editable Poly and Edit Poly. And as you can see, mine is an Editable Poly. So if I want to simplify my geometry by welding any of the vertices or whatnot, or extrude from those vertices, I definitely can. But for what I'm doing right here, I'm going to say that this is pretty good for the chest of what I'm going to do. And what I'm creating is I'm going to create a robot that can hover. It has no legs. It will have arms and a head and whatnot, but it's going to be very simple, just so that we can get the foundation of how to create a mesh. So from here, I've got my chest plate, and I'm going to make sure that I name my object. And I would definitely get into a good habit of naming everything that you create. The reason why is, one, so you know what it is, but two, more importantly, if someone else is helping you with your project or helping you with whatever, or if they have to go work in your file, they don't have to do any kind of guesswork on what piece is what. If you have 97 objects in your scene and it goes from box 001 to box 098, that's kind of confusing. So we definitely want to name everything that we create. So from here, let's go back to our standard primitives, create a cylinder. And I don't need any height segments there. Okay, we got a neck. Now let's create another box, and we'll kind of shape it into a head. Okay, I'm going to give myself some edge loops here, or segments. Maybe 2, that's fine. And let's start off with this being completely square. So I'm going to change my link, width, and height segments to all be the same. So I'm completely square. Now we have kind of like a Rubik's Cube. Going to convert that to an editable poly. And I'm converting everything to an editable poly on purpose. And towards the end of the video, we'll see why. I'm going to put this here on my robot. And I'm going to take a little bit of time to shape my robot, just a little bit. So I'm going to take these edges here, bring them down a little bit, because I want more of a rounded shape. Maybe I'll scale them in a little bit. And maybe here I'll bring this upwards, bring this upwards. Maybe bring this one in, so now I've got more of a head shape on my side. Bring this upwards. Maybe I want to bring the face out just a bit, so I have kind of like a nose. Then I can always bring this back down. So we look kind of okay for the side, but on the front, we still look very boxy. So let's come in and maybe scale this inward a little bit. Bring this in this way a little bit. Do the same thing over here. Okay, maybe I want the front of my face to be a little bit more narrow than the side. And when you're creating your character, you can create it however you want. You can make it look however you want if you understand how to use the tools. Now there is an issue that we have here on either side that we can look into. If I move my camera in just a way, I can see that this is cut out really strange. And this has to do with the way that our edges are facing. So here we don't have that issue on this side. You can see we have an edge here. But if we rotate over here, we can see we don't have that one. So in order to change that, what I'm going to do is go to my edges, and I'm going to come down here to turn. And it's going to show all of these triangulated polygons. So now I can see how each polygon is made up of two triangles. And I see this edge right here. And now that I have it on turn, I can turn this edge this way. And now I match with what I had on the other side. Okay. So let's go back into our vertices. We see that we had some issues, so I'm going to go back and fix what was not done last time. I'll come back over here, do the same thing. Okay, and anywhere on here, if I want to bring that geometry out, I can. If I understand the tools, I can do pretty much whatever I want. The only limitations I have is my imagination and the knowledge I have about the tools. Now remember, this is still watertight. We haven't deleted any polygons. We haven't deleted any vertices. And anytime I see any one of those edges that need to be turned, then I can definitely do that. Maybe here and here, scale these in a little bit. Get more of a rounded head. Okay. I'm kind of digging it. If it looks a little small for the body, we can always scale it upwards. Scale it to be bigger. Okay, I'm liking that. So what I'm going to do now is create a sphere, just a basic sphere, maybe 16 segments. And this is going to serve as where my arm connects to my robot body. Now this mesh is what's called clipping into this other mesh we can see here, but that's okay. It's okay, because what it's actually going to do is it's going to help us because it's going to look like it's attached. So this is going to serve as my shoulder. And then we're going to need an upper arm and a lower arm. So let's create maybe a box. And I don't need all these segments for this arm. One thing that I always want to try to do is what's called preserve geometry. And what I mean by that is if I can do what I want with a low poly model, then there's no point in creating a high poly one just for the sake of having polygons. And a lot of times you'll see models that look very simplistic and yet they have 200,000, 300,000, 400,000 polys. And that's honestly not the way that you want to build a model. You want to try to do the most you can with the lowest amount of polygons that you can. It's a good rule of thumb. The video game and movie industry today is a lot more powerful than it used to be. But if you can save polygons in one place, you can always use them somewhere else. So maybe instead of having a 300,000 poly character, you have a 15,000 poly character. Well, that means that I have 275,000 polys that I can use somewhere else. 2,800, 285,000, okay. That I can use somewhere else. So maybe I can have more trees in my scene or more buildings or just any number of things. Okay, so I don't need these, but maybe I'll do here. Again, I'm going to convert this into an editable poly because I want to be able to manipulate it. So I'll scale this down a little bit. I'm going to move this back. Move this back so now it looks like our arm is kind of bent. Maybe scale it up here. maybe a little here. We're giving our object shape. Then I'll move that object. So it's also clipping, but that's fine because now we look like it's part of the shoulder. And if I want that to be a little longer, which I do, I can always scale that a little bit. Okay. And then maybe I want to create a cylinder, and I'm going to use the cylinder as the elbow. And again, I want to make sure that I'm not using geometry unnecessarily. I don't want to have high poly pieces on there just for the sake of having higher polygon pieces, or the number of polygons. So I'll turn this on, rotate this 90 degrees. And I'm going to bring this up here. And this is going to serve as my elbow. If that's too big, I can always scale that down. And then just for the sake of simplicity, I'm going to take this piece and copy it. And so I'm going to hold down Shift and move my piece. And let's mirror it. And I want to mirror on the y-axis. So I'm going to click OK. Now I've got the bottom part of my arm. I'm going to scale that a little bit. It's a little bit too big for what I want to do. Okay. Then let's create some kind of like gripper claw thing. What would be the best way to do that? Maybe we'll create another cylinder. And I'm going to do a cap segment, because I'm going to use this to create my geometry that I want. So I'm going to convert this into an editable poly. And then straight off, I'm going to select these two vertices in the middle, and I'm going to delete them. And I'm also going to go to my top view and maybe delete these 4 sets of polygons. So now we have kind of like a claw. The problem is that now I'm no longer watertight, but I can fix that. I'm going to go into my edges and select each one of these edges on the outside and on the inside of the bottom. And just like we held Shift to create or to copy geometry, a whole set, we're going to do that the same thing with our edge. So I'm going to hold down Shift, keep it down. I'm going to press and hold to drag my geometry upwards. Okay. So that hole that we had is now covered, but the vertices that I created here aren't welded. So then I'm going to go to my vertex, select all the top vertices, because a lot of the ones that I need to weld are in the top. I'm going to go to weld, but I'm going to open my settings window. And we saw by default, we saw it snap. So let's watch that again. So we have this small hole here. When I go to weld and click my settings, we can see that 0.1 was enough to make that snap together. And we see that before we had 72 vertices, now we have 56. So now that's watertight. I'm going to rotate this 90 degrees and maybe rotate it 90 degrees on the x-axis as well. And move this up to my hand. And this is way too big, so I'm going to scale it. Okay, so I have this, and before we talked about that everything was an editable poly, and we did that on purpose, and now I'm going to kind of show you why we did that. There's one feature that we have in editable poly is I can attach other editable poly pieces. So I'm going to say in my edit poly, we have a button called attach, And even if the geometry isn't in Editable Poly, like this is just our standard sphere, then I'm going to attach. And now everything that I'm doing here is attached. And again, I want to make sure I name it. So maybe I'll name this left arm. And because this is all one piece, I can again mirror it. So I'm going to mirror it on the x-axis. Click OK. I want to make sure, okay, so what I'm going to do is, now that I have this as one piece, I'm going to mirror it so I don't have to do all the same work for the other side. So I'm going to go to my mirror tool, and I want to make sure that I'm making a copy, and it will copy my object. And I want to go ahead and rename this. So instead of left arm 001, I'm going to name it right arm, and bring it over to this other side. And I can make sure they're even in the same spot. If I say the X translation is 10.925, well, let's make this one negative 10.925. Okay, so we have part of our robot. Now let's make the little part that hovers. And all I'm going to do for that is just do a cylinder, or I'm sorry, a sphere, and maybe squish that down a little bit. So I'm going to scale it. And then bring that up to the body. Okay, and they're hitting my arm, which before we were talking about the cylinder or the sphere, it's fine if it was cutting into the chest because those parts will move, but we don't want it to make it look like the arm can pass through this part that helps the robot float. So I'm going to shrink that down. Okay, and what I have is I have different meshes that are put together. Each one is watertight. We made sure of that. To skin it, if we skinned it like this, what would happen is we would have to skin each different piece to the bones that are corresponding to it. And you can do that if you want to, but instead we're going to make this one entire mesh. So I'm going to select my chest, or whichever bone, it doesn't really matter. And again, in that Edit Poly, I'm going to go to Attach, and I'm going to attach all the other pieces of my robot. So now I have one mesh. As far as 3ds Max is concerned, this is one mesh. And it's okay if we have this geometry overlapping. We still have a watertight model made up of different pieces. And then I can skin this just as I would anything else. And all I'm doing is I'm coming in and checking. I see that I have a line here. So I'm going to go to my edge, and I'm going to turn my edges here. And come over here and see if I have the same one. A lot of times if you have an edge that you want to turn on one side, it also needs to be turned on the other. But I don't see too much of that right here. So what we did is we used very simple techniques in using different shapes, modifying those shapes, and then putting them together to create an object. In this case, a little floating robot. And again, this is watertight. What I would suggest is to play around and see if you can create objects like we did here with different shapes and putting them together. Until then, have fun.